Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. There's only 6 months left to rewrite your cybersecurity awareness training into Limerick form. Remember, training should be about changing behaviors, not trivia. For example, there once was a scam for credentials whose naming ignored the essentials. Now everyone's wishing to relabel phishing and forgetting passkeys potentials. Which means this week we chat with Benedek Gagyi about the importance of user experience to security and why good UX makes great security. In the news segment, a Go Fetch side channel, a security education plan, a preference for fuzzing, a list of problems, and more. Just say phishing. And stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
This is episode 278, recorded March 25th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Phishing.
Music to my ears. Thank you, John. And A+ on the t-shirt. For those of you who are just listening to audio, go check our video on YouTube for that shirt. We also have Akira Brand. Hello, Akira.
Hey, I was trying to think of a limerick in like the past 10 seconds, but I'm going to have to get back to you on that one.
No pressure. We've got a whole new segment coming up as well. Thank you, Akira. As a quick announcement, we are always looking for great guests for all of the Security Weekly shows. Submit your suggestions at securityweekly.com/guests. Benedek is a developer, teacher, and sports fanatic. In his free time, he's researching the patterns and algorithms connecting baseball, tea, BJJ, and drums. His devotion to impeccable and secure user experience is rivaled only by his constant search for the perfect brew of Chinese pu'er tea. Hello, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me. Love that introduction.
Thank you so much. One of the things we like to do here is be different. And you're one of our different sort of guests because you are the first one to come on and I think properly talk with us about user experience. And in the show notes, I kind of introduced this in the sense of AppSec or InfoSec in general has a really bad habit of blaming the user. You did wrong. Our security is the problem of the user. I think you can help us understand why that is a bad attitude and how user experience helps us. So first, tell us a little bit about your experience with user experience and developers and security. How did these pillars come together for you?
Yeah, I think I got very lucky in my career. Like I would say I'm basically a developer, a full stack developer, but I got some really interesting side quests during the years. One of those was that I went through like a proper UX training and actually worked as a UX designer for a bit. And then a bit later, I got the chance to work in a proper security team at LastPass, the password manager. So I actually sold that side too. And although since then I'm back to the, let's say, more traditional developer role, I kind of carry with me all these experiences and kind of try to wear all those different hats and look through all those different views and kind of combine these things, which doesn't make me particularly good in these other fields, but it helps having like a broader perspective.
Well, I think at the very least, just having some training in UX, you're a step ahead of many security teams, security orgs, possibly even developers. And I'm curious, as you're describing that, these are distinct teams. So, UX, developers, security, do they talk to each other? How often do they talk to each other?
That's on point. Most of the cases, probably never. Like it's very
never.
Very typical for a UX person and a security person to never meet, never be in the same meeting, never have discussions. Mostly these are silos that live very separately, probably in separate levels or like floors if it's a bigger company. And all these topics kind of like meet in the hands of developers. And in my experience, especially in bigger companies, it's when you're looking at these different fields, it feels like a kind of like a waterfall model where the UX person designs something, then the developers implement it, and then if everything works fine before release, somebody from security takes a look, and then they might request some changes. But it's not really like a collaborative process at all, and we can feel it. Like if you look. You could look at it like this. There are many products and many situations in the wild where you can actually pinpoint how this process happened, and one or the other party didn't have as much say as they probably should have.
Well, maybe that's a great opportunity to maybe walk us through an example or two in the sense of, why is the user experience important? Could you point to some of those examples or talk about here's a good UX versus a bad UX on top of a product, whether it's security or not?
Yeah, like I like to preface this by saying that UX, there are many different ways to define it, but in this context, UX is the whole experience that the user has, and we have to recognize that security is part of that. So if you're using a product and for doesn't matter whose fault, but you get hacked and you lose some money, for example, that will be connected to the experience that you had with the given product. You won't think that it's a great product because you got scammed. So it's like the security has to be considered as part of the final user experience. So when we're talking about what's a good user experience, something at the board usually thrown around is something that's intuitive, but I'd like to say something that's simple, something that works as it's supposed to on the first try, on the first thing that you want to do. Your first mental model that you make of that thing actually matches the reality. So that kind of thing where it just stands out of the way, or in some cases it sparks the right emotions, for example, joy, or in case of video games, it can be another host of different emotions. But the point is that what the makers intended, that's the actual feeling that the user gets, and that's the actual experience that the user gets. The wider the gap between the intended and the actual, I'd say the worse the UX.
So one example that comes to mind for me is the obvious of CAPTCHAs. CAPTCHAs always interrupt a workflow. They're annoying to do, and it's sort of like, why am I bothering with this? I think others would be like password composition rules. Like, why am I being told they have to be so complex or not complex? How do you look at something like, choosing a correct password from a user experience perspective?
I love that you brought up password composition rules, because it's such a weird thing, because you would expect that there's consensus, because it's kind of like mathematical and easy to grasp. Passwords has been with us for a very long time. And still, if you just Google search, what is a strong password? The first three results will be different. One will say it has to be X amount of characters, or has to have special characters, and blah, blah, blah. And this is weird, because from the security point of view, you understand that the more complex the password, the bigger the entropy, harder to crack. But if you look at it from the UX point of view, if you raise the bar too high, what it results in is, in most cases, people reusing their passwords, because if it's super complex, they won't remember 10 of them. And yes, we have password managers, but we also have statistics on how many people are not using password managers. So if you look at it realistically, by having a very high standard, and you basically make the UX worse, and if the UX is not ideal, then people will try to circumnavigate that. And one of those ways is by reusing passwords. And again, as security people, if you just stop and think about this for a second, what is more realistic? Having account stolen because a password was used, or because the entropy was high but not super high? You haven't used, you have 16 characters, but only 2 of them are not letters. Which is the bigger threat? It's nice to go from 99% to 100, but it would be pretty cool if we focused on that 99% first to actually have.
Yes. I love how you phrase that, and you're getting into essentially threat modeling, because so many of the arguments I've seen for password complexity are predicated on the idea that the password hash is stolen and someone is running that hash. But if you can compromise that password hash, then there's a lot of things that probably went wrong as well. So you're bringing threat modeling, I think, to this discussion. You also mentioned the idea of user behavior, because there's one thing that we, security folks want to have good password, do all these good behaviors, but the UI or the user experience may be teaching bad behaviors. Tell us a little bit more about how that can emerge, like what a bad user experience, why that can have such negative consequences.
Yeah, so it's in the previous example, I kind of might have suggested that, if the security is too strict, then that will result in less than positive user behavior. But the other can be true too. When we try to make it too easy, then it's really easy to get users used to a behavior that's far from ideal. One of the examples I like to use is that a few years ago, when 3DS was introduced in Europe, like a lot of banks started enrolling it, but not all their online banking users had a second factor to check. Like for example, they didn't have like a phone number registered, or they didn't have the app downloaded or something like that. So in this case, what a security person would say is that, okay, sorry, then we'll just stop. We won't let you use the app or the online app. First, register a phone number or some kind of second factor, and then you can actually wire some money or stuff like that. But from the UX point of view, you're like, oh no, that's going to be too harsh on a lot of users. So one of the banks came up with this idea that what if we ask them to enter their online banking password? It's basically a second factor. We can check for it in our database. It works as it should. The problem is it teaches users to introduce their online banking password into a random pop-up page that they never seen, and it works. So it's teaching them a behavior that is absolutely shouldn't be there. So you kind of made it easier to like actually process an operation. At the same time, you made it easier for somebody who's doing phishing to trap these people. So there's the other end is possible too.
Yeah, I like that, because I cringe at the idea of cybersecurity awareness training programs starting to tell users, here's how to inspect whether this is a frame, and the frame actually belongs to the bank. So it's okay to type into your password into this frame. But that just seems like madness. There's no utility there. So we're talking about the user experience. You're giving us some good examples. One of the things I don't want to skip over actually is, what is a user? Does that matter? Why is that question important, or is it?
It is very important, because in a super general sense, user experience makes sense when it's tailored to the specific user. And when I talk with fellow developers, a really easy way to like bring out more empathy from them is showing them that, hey, often you're the user. There are many products where the developer is the actual user, and sometimes we call it DX, like developer experience, but it's actually the same thing. And just to get back to the earlier topic of like user education, a really good example is npm audit, which is a command that you run if you have like a project that uses npm, and it will tell you what CVEs are present in your project. Because of the nature how the npm ecosystem is built, you have this number will be large, like in the matter of hundreds. So what does it teach developers? It teaches them that I'll never have the time to fix 300 problems, especially that most of them are transitive dependencies, so it's really tricky. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to ignore them. And that basically teaches the developers to ignore all the things that the tooling says. So sometimes the users are developers in themselves. Or another typical example is that when you're designing an API that will be, for example, open, you're basically designing a user experience without a UI. So somebody will use it. Somebody will have to understand your assumptions. Somebody will have to like connect your train of thought. And that's again, very similar. And the funny thing is that when we say UX, we automatically associate to UI, but there's an important distinction there. Like for a user to experience your product, it doesn't have to have a UI. And the second important consequence is that there's so much tooling that UX people already developed, so many approaches, so many techniques to like find the right solutions. And why can't we use them when we're designing an API? We absolutely can. User research has a lot of good tooling, like quantitative, qualitative research. There are a lot of different things that developers, security people can take away as tools from UX people and use them in the daily work.
That's a really fun description of it. The API is is user experience without the UI. There's a classic API in terms of naming things, the React's dangerously set inner HTML. That raises some red flags. That kind of communicates to the user, this is dangerous. Something bad is going on here. Why should you be using this? Do you have similar examples of security folks building an API or just developers and saying don't just use this securely. Don't make any mistakes as you use our API. That seems like the weak way of doing developer experience.
There are nowadays a lot of these very good examples. For example, I chatted with a slightly less experienced developer, and CSurf came up, and I realized they don't really know about it because they've been using frameworks that basically have all the countermeasures already built in. The problem basically is mostly solved, and they don't need to know about it because it's so well done. In general, I think that if it's easier to write secure code than unsecure code, then most of the code will be secure. And the opposite is true, right? Nobody or most people don't set out writing their app in a way that it should include SQL injection. And it's super well known with the Bobby tables and all the jokes. And still it happens. Why? Because in many situations, it's just so easy to add one more parameter and link it directly to a UI field, and you're done, and your task is ready and you can ship it. The problem is that it's so easy to write something insecure that it's bound to happen. So like both ends are true. When it's super easy to do something right, then people will mostly do the right thing. When it's easier to do it wrong.
I wonder, tying back to the question of what is a user, part of what you're describing there is, another way to ask that question is, what assumptions are safe to make about your user? Because you mentioned, for example, CSurf or SQL injection. Is it fair to assume that all developers have read the OWASP Top 10, or that the OWASP Top 10 is informative enough to be instructive to how to counter that? Throwing other terms like MFA or 2FA or 2SV, there's not even a consistency. You mentioned inconsistency in passwords. There's not even a consistency in how different websites describe more than one factor.
Yeah, like in general, like that's a typical problem in communication, where you kind of like assume that the other part has some knowledge and they don't, so they misunderstand. I think it's very easy. It's a very easy mistake to make. Like developers and security people chat about something, they speak the same lingo, and then it ends up in front of the user and they don't know what to do. Like you mentioned MFA, it's a typical thing. I always kind of cringe when I see it written in like the abbreviation in like a website. Like I understand that, but how many others do? Like it's very, very tricky to nail. And yeah, we get back to the idea of let's involve the people whose job is to like make these kind of connections, who have the right empathy for the right user. And those are the UX people. It's their job to understand both the users, their mental models, and understand the problem space, understand the product. They are the right people to ask. So, and it's so weird because if you don't have the processes, why would you go with like you just added a random warning string, like why should I go to another thing? It takes so much time. But yeah, sometimes it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, like general error or kernel panic are cool hacker names, but they are not useful, user-friendly like error messages. So Ben, you're talking about turning to the UX folks for that communication, for that research. How then do the UX folks? How does a conversation with the security team go then look like? How do you bridge the two, bring them together, and talk about this is what we should be doing? This is actually going to be more secure because of behavior, for example.
we can talk about how that would look in an ideal world, and that's fun, but obviously it's kind of far from the reality of most of the listeners and most developers experience. I think the more realistic approach is that the developers are the people who can make these connections. So basically, they are the field where these two others kind of meet. At the developers table is where UX and security kind of meet. So they have the chance to recognize, whoa, we should probably involve security here because this sounds a bit too smooth. Like should that work that easily, or the other way around? Like, I love that you added this, but we should probably check with UX if they are okay because it might be causing too much friction. So it's basically, it's not like developers don't have enough responsibilities already, but I think it's kind of, they are the ones who can make a difference in this. And yeah, nobody loves having meetings, but sometimes just getting in a room and talking about will result in a lot of different and interesting directions that are not possible to have if the right people are not having the discussions. And this is the problem that we talked about earlier, that often security and UX people, they don't talk at all. So it's even just getting them in a room is a huge success. Okay, maybe one more practical thing, because this is maybe a bit too generic, would be to involve UX people in threat modeling. And yeah, threat modeling can get super technical. Like it's if it involves a certain part of the product, there is no need for a UX person to join a threat modeling about cloud security and certificate management and stuff like that. But if it involves the UI, if it's a feature that has a lot of like UI or user interaction pieces, then definitely, okay, there might be a few discussions that go over their heads, but still the fact that they're there and they can see like what are the problems, what are we trying to solve, it would be a huge help. And if like usually it might be intimidating a bit to like involve random people, but at the end of the day, everybody's working on one product and everybody's working on one user experience. So like everybody will be motivated to chime in and like make it better.
I like where you're coming from, thinking about empathy and the user experience, not just purely for that end user, but the DX, the developer, or security, or other folks along that path as well. I've got a lot of UI and UX friends. One of my best friends is UX. So I've watched you and people like you at work many times with lots of interest. And it's really interesting to me, the psychology behind a lot of what you have to do, which is where I want to go for a second. I'm thinking about this compared to InfoSec people, particularly application security people. Frequently, where the empathy part comes in here, frequently when application security people come into the developer portion of the floor, everyone's like, oh no, here comes those guys again. And I'm pretty sure it's the same way frequently for UX, right? Because you come along, usually they want to do like a user study and like figure out the best way to do it and like go and interview people and do all these type of things. And everyone's like, oh my God, we just want to get like a button on the screen. So I'm curious, with that empathetic point of view, how have you countered that, or how have you worked with that, or it's the same problem that AppSec people face frequently. It's like, how do we get people to mend to our ways in a way, or bend to our ways? But I'm curious to hear from like sort of your profession and how that's worked out for you.
Yeah, whichever side I was on of this discussion, I absolutely had the AppSec part too, where at last pass we were like going at the developers and they were seeing us and oh no.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely know what you're talking about. I think in all these cases, it was always a clash between like processes, because as a company you have to have like processes, and it's the more siloed these worlds are, it's easier to make these processes work, because it's much easier to say that this group produces an output and the other group consumes it. And while in practice, it would be much better to have like a constant discussion and more empathy towards like what the others' problems are, what their motivations are, why they are coming. So I think this is pretty, like, I'm not saying anything new, that in AppSec world, it's much better to have this constant discussion with your developers and not just like throw random bugs at them, but actually make them understand why these are important, why we're working on certain things, why certain scan outputs are more important or more urgent. Basically, have buy-in from them. A really good example is like the security champion programs. That's how I learned a lot about security, and that was a really good way for the security team at my given company to kind of like gather buy-in from the developer teams. And the same goes for UX too. Like if there's like this constant discussion, then it's not just a black UX is not just a black box where you throw in like, hey, I need a button, and then in a week you get like a Figma design. If it's like a back and forth, then it's much easier to understand each other's problem and actually work together on these things. So yeah, I never really connected it, but it makes a lot of sense that these two are very, very similar in this regard.
What I've seen, and where I'm sort of coming from, this is like frequently in startups, someone will convince the CEO or someone high up that they, let's go and get the UX people because we want our product to have a great UX. And that sounds amazing at first, right? Until they actually understand how long that takes. And I think that the parallel there to me is not just the actual engagement, but also what people want out of our products when we're building them, particularly in smaller companies, versus what we have the budget or resources for, either time or people or whatever else. It seems like there's a bit of an art of the dance for both of us to figure out how do we sort of meander into the right part of someone's personality or brain and actually say, hey, this is a good thing and we're going to make it palatable, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also a very interesting similarity that in most of the cases, especially in the case that you mentioned, where you already have kind of a product that you're bringing in UX people to like take it up a notch, then it will be very similar to what AppSec people face. That, okay, we have a product, which is kind of okay, but we need to raise the bar. But some of these changes done after the fact are really hard to do, not just technically, but also like, okay, it's at the end of the day, it's going to be the same. Like how do I get resources for that? Like how do you change something after the fact and make it better from UX or security point of view when it's already working, it's already making money? And those kind of discussions, I think, sound very familiar. It's again a very interesting similarity. And frankly, finding these similarities is really good because it already helps like have more empathy towards the other group and like have more connection with them. So yeah, I love that we're getting into this.
Ben, I wonder, I was trying to put the two together, UX and cybersecurity, and I was really struggling until about 5 seconds ago, and I want to get your take on something. And that is, from my experience with UX, a lot of it is about like happy path, guiding the user to do what you functionally want the user to do in a way that does like spark joy with them, right? Where they're wanting to come back and do it again. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this sounds a lot like just social engineering, right? In some ways. So if I was like a hacker, right, and I wanted to know how do I get people to do what I want them to do from a UX perspective, what would be like a cardinal rule that you would give to me as someone that's more like social engineering minded, whereas the UX person is more like happy path minded? What would you say would be like a good crossover?
Ooh, that's a very tricky question. I'm not really sure I'm getting it right. So I'll give you an answer and let me know if that was the one that you were looking for.
Yeah, for sure.
So I definitely see that one of the best UX designers are people who do phishing for a living, because that's basically creating a user experience where they believe and think what you want them to think and believe. So yeah, that's a case when you're kind of like manipulating the user, and in this case, it's manipulation, not guiding. But I think a very similar situation, if you already talked about DX, arises when pen testers like test, for example, an API. Basically, they are trying to find the points that are different from how they should be, how they live in the minds of the developers. And just like pen testers understand the code more than the people who wrote it, it's similar with UX people. Like the users will know your product probably better than the developers who developed it, and the UX people should be there to bridge that, to kind of like bring those two together and get those understandings through interviews, for example, from users and then bring it back. Like just the way like a pen test brings back the understanding from the red team people to the developers is the same for UX. Like bring back that understanding from the users and give it back to the developers. And I'm not sure if I answered the question or
that's
just
beautiful.
like a total random tangent.
As I was asking the question too, I was like, I'm not sure if I'm saying this well, but I think we got there. So that's great perspective. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And it speaks out to Akira like dark patterns. Like with phishing, they'll set up a sense of urgency, or they'll set up a sense of all you want to do is log into your bank account. So here is the way to make it easy. And that way to make it easy might just be a chat interface that pops up and says, looks like you're having a problem logging in here. What's your password? What's the factor you just got from your SMS? We'll fill it in for you. Things like this that start to be manipulation, clearly to the detriment of the user rather than to their benefit. And Ben, I think you gave us some good insights there with that focus on how do we actually help the user when that user is developers, that we want them to go through a favored path. I wanted to do one more thing on top of kind of this idea about who the user is, a little bit of what John was asking about too, in the sense of just what do requirements look like from a UX perspective? Because I'm guessing it's something a little bit more useful or insightful than this button should be blue instead of green, or that button is 5 pixels too wide. That doesn't sound like user experience to me. What does a user experience requirement look like so that when we have this conversation with the developers, the security team, we kind of know what to expect?
Ooh, that's a very wide topic, and I think the definition will vary from case to case. I think in this context, what's relevant is that it's kind of what Akira said earlier, that the UX people will focus on the happy path, like how many people will complete this registration. How can I make the friction less? How can I make this process easier, or easy being a very subjective word, but like how can I guide more people in the direction I want them to go? And button colors and all that UI things are just like tools for that. At the end of the day, it's like you have like in practice, you probably have some kind of KPI in mind. Like I want to raise this by 5%, or I want this many people to register and stuff like that. And the way you achieve it is by like one of your tools is going to be UI. But like we talked about earlier, in case on API, it can be different. Sometimes the solution is marketing, not changing the UI at all, or messaging or anything like that. And it's similar with security. Sometimes you have to add, change your encryption algorithm, and sometimes you have to organize a training. So yeah, it's you have an end goal. You want to make something more secure, but how you go about it is you just choose something from your tool set.
Yeah, and maybe to tie into Akira's question too is sort of the difference between uncheck this box to unsubscribe versus don't uncheck this box to not stop receiving emails from us. Which one of those is the helpful UX? Which one of those is the dark pattern? But Ben, that was my little dip into user experience. But we'd love to have you take a dip into your AppSec side of the brain and help us answer a question we've been asking all of our guests, which is to complete this phrase. AppSec is most likely to what? Fill in that blank for us.
Stay with us. I had this discussion a few times already, where we were talking about like the future of like the whole field, and like what are safer positions. Like for example, graphical designers are quite afraid of generative AI, or like will it make sense to have front end developers if some new framework comes out that will somehow make it obsolete? So there's always discussions, and I feel like right now there are only two safe bets in like if you're choosing your career in as a developer, programmer, or whatever you call it. It's basically AI and AppSec. Like these are the two things that will be there. We'll keep staying. And maybe AppSec in this particular interpretation is something wider, because obviously, like, if you consider pen testers part of AppSec or not, but at the end of the day, basically security and AI, these are the two things that are here to stay, in my view. And yeah, as a developer, I like to add, because if we talked so much about UX, yeah, that will be always there. Like the part where you have to connect the technical thing with actual humans, that's where UX people are important, and they will always need to make that connection. So yeah, these are
awesome. I love that. It's yes, the UX designers are helping us stay more human than human. For those of you who get the Blade Runner reference. Ben, thank you so much. This was a very different type of conversation for us, but I think very enlightening and very helpful. You're helping us and our listeners, the security community, understanding why the user actually is important to this conversation, to what they're building.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun, and yeah, it kind of shows how many interesting tangents there are when you talk to people who have slightly different backgrounds. So if this was fun, then I would encourage everybody to just like go and try to open those silos, talk to the other team. Maybe you figure out something very interesting or very useful.
That's a wonderful message to end on, and we're going to have you back, because there were definitely some tangents that we didn't we didn't take as much as we could, but we did take the chance to also have John and Akira join us, as well as everyone. Want to say thank you. We do need to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.